bit of background about the world of crime and its prevention. I go into prisons, rather fortunately I get out at the end of the day, I have to say that. Some people think they're club, they're club holiday resorts, but they're very much not. And the idea of going into prisons is to get the offender's perspective, to understand their view of the crime. And I have to say, as a criminologist, it's both unusual to go into prisons and extremely informative to do so. And the sorts of questions that I ask them are, why did you choose that target? What made it easy? What made it difficult? What sort of planning was involved? Where did you get the information from? What were the risk factors and how did you overcome them? If you were doing it again, how would you do it differently? How do you now reflect on your crime from a prison cell? And I would say that if you don't ask those questions, you're missing a massive information. And I would say they are truly well informed about the world of crime and its prevention. And perhaps the most daunting finding from that research is in response to that question of why did you choose that target? By far, the most common answer is because it was easy. Now, how can it be that so many offenders across 2 decades of work in prison, more than that in fact, in response to the world of why did you do it and why did you choose that particular target on that day? Because it was easy. And I think that the answer to that question is what's driven so much of the work that I've been involved with, to try and think through the way in which we identify the sorts of things that work and the sorts of ways in which we can begin to tackle the world of crime. Just as an aside, and I'll do quite a few asides in this talk if that's all right with you. When I'm doing radio or TV interviews, particularly radio interviews, one of the questions they frequently throw at the end is, Professor Gill, if you could do one thing about crime, what would it be? And of course, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be doing a radio interview, I'd be on the beach somewhere. But I don't know the answer to that. But if I could say an answer, and I'm saying this to an educated audience, if I could say an answer based on work I've done with offenders in prison, it might be, and by the way, before I say this answer, I don't know whether it's brilliant or useless. So I'll say it and you be the judge. If I could say something, I would say, make offenders believe they're going to get caught. Because it's the assumption they're not going to get caught that drives so much the world of crime. And that's the context, actually, for this work that we've been doing on organised crime. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing on organised crime. It's done with colleagues at the Police Foundation, a think tank in England. And we've been working for a couple of years now, in fact 3 years now, on this whole area of organised crime. It was funded by a group called the Dawes Trust, and they funded this research not because they wanted to develop theoretical understanding as much, which is often the case in academic research, but because they wanted to develop insights and ideas that could be used by practitioners to respond differently to this thing called organised crime. So what I would like to do, because Rick has picked on this topic and asked that I engage with you on it, is tell you a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing, some of the issues that have cropped up, and some of the findings that we've got so far. And I'll give you a place where you can download the report at the end, free of charge. Always choke when I say those words, free of charge, but free of charge. And if any of you want to give me your card afterwards, I will update you on the latest set of findings which are about to come out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just to make sure I do cover in what I hope will be a talk about crime generally, not just organised crime, I've just got a few slides that I want to go through. Now, organised crime, let's just get our heads around this. Most of the work on organised crime has been focused around the world of drugs and drug supply has been relatively well researched. What's been much less implicit or explicit in the research that's come out is that what is the impact this has on local communities. So we know about the international dimension, we know that that's facilitated much of the work on organised crime, but what about the local communities? What's the impact there? How does it make a difference? And how big is the problem? Now these are tricky questions to answer, and what I'm going to show you in the next half an hour or so is some of the ways in which we've attempted to tackle it. As I say, I'm going to rush through this bit just to give you some key insights, conscious, please do come in, just conscious that there's a report at the end that's got all this in more detail, and some of the work is ongoing, and I can feed that to you if you're interested as we go through. So just to tackle some of the issues. Organised crime. Those damn words, organised and crime. Now, this is hotly contested territory. I'm just going to say what we did for now, although there's a lot of thinking around what organised means. But we used what is the official definition in the UK, is a serious crime planned, coordinated and conducted by people working together on a continuous basis. There's all sorts of issues in academic literature, because in academia this is what we like to do. We question, what does continuous mean? What does working together mean? But for today, we're not going to go into that. That's just what I'm going to tell you is what we've used. Now, the 4 Ps, are these familiar to anybody in this room, these 4 Ps? They are to some and not to others. Okay. So very, very briefly, these 4 Ps were very much the UK terrorism strategy. It still is. To pursue offenders, to prevent. This is, by the way, prevent here is not prevent crime, it's to prevent people getting into crime. It's the preventing of offenders from engaging in serious crime. To protect, obviously to protect against serious crime, and to prepare for the impacts. So these are the sorts of 4 Ps that have governed terrorism. And they've been applied to the world of organised crime too. It's almost as if we thought of something for terrorism, let's see if we can get something for organised. Oh, let's take those 4. They're not bad actually, they're not bad concepts. And we've also got, just to complicate it, a whole range of agencies dealing with this. So this comes to be one of the problems, is that when you're tackling organised crime, there's so many different groups involved. And I'm not going to go through all of what they do, because it will take me quite a while just to do that. In fact, that's a talk in itself. Just that I'll come back to this point. There's a whole range of agencies involved in different ways. And some of these are within the policing circles, and some of these are completely separate. And in different ways, they have a role to play against tackling different sorts of organised crime. So what we were trying to do is, what does organised crime look like at the local level? In other words, locally in communities, what does it look like? It's very easy on an abstract level to talk about organised crime is this, and that's what research has been pretty good at actually, and examining the different groups and how they work. But if you're in a community, what difference does it make? And I want to say a little bit about that today. Who are the perpetrators, and what sorts of crimes do they commit, and why, and how? Who is affected by it, and in what ways? How much of the problem is it, and how serious is it? Now, these are the sorts of questions that we address in the report. Not all of those am I going to focus on today, because I've only got a bit of time, but I'm going to leave you some insight into the sorts of things that we've said. This bit about hidden. We've tried to uncover some of the hidden aspects to crime, and I'm going to be talking about 2 offence types in particular. I'm going to be talking about fraud and sex crimes, partly because they're very hidden, and we've tried to get a perspective on how much of that hidden can we begin to know about, and when we do know about it, what does it say about the extent to which this is a major concern. And of course, if you don't know about a problem, you can't tackle it. And with both those offence types, that's definitely been a characteristic. So, the vast majority of the public, in surveys that have been done by other researchers, believe that organised crime is a major problem, but only 1 in 3 think it's a problem in their area. Not particularly unusual on surveys of crime and people's views, by the way. There's a tendency to feel it is a problem, but a little bit less so here. But we've come back, partly is that how would you know anyway if it's hidden, if not much is known about it? Now, OCGs, organised crime groups. We had a look at the world of organised crime groups and the role of intimidation and the extent to which the work that they did as organised crime groups was known and seen and felt by communities. And we started to look at the way that different types of crime groups operated, the environment in which they operate, and the different types of harms caused to communities. So, just in summary then, the bit about this is to say, what does this mean at the sharp end for people in communities who are suffering and for law enforcement agencies in trying to engage with that problem? What's it like there? And that's the area where there's been very little research anywhere in the world. So we were trying to fill a gap in bridging that gap between, okay, we've got our mafia, but what about what's happening locally and how people feel and respond? What we do know, taking fraud first, is that the government has a pretty good idea, it thinks, of the number of organised crime groups. And as you can see, of the 7,500 or so, over 1,300 were linked to fraudulent activity in some way. So fraud's a bit of a driver. Big news in the UK, by the way. This might be, I don't know whether it'll be a surprise to Australia or not. 2 ways of measuring crime, very briefly: crime figures and asking victims whether they've been a victim of an offence. They've suddenly asked victims about fraud, and it's blown all the figures sky high. So about half the crime in the UK is related to fraud. Oh my goodness. Next big issue is when you look at the impact on victims, it's suddenly become apparent that, and I'll come into this in a minute, fraud is serious. This view that if you're a victim of fraud, it's not that serious, has been blown by all the research. And suddenly there is, not only is the majority of crime fraud related, worse still, fraud is actually quite a serious crime. And I say this to you, what would you rather happen to you? Be punched on the face on a night out, very serious, not good at all, or lose your life savings? Just for a second. So we shouldn't be, the point is, we shouldn't be particularly surprised that losing a lot of money is not serious. But there's a tendency to think that it hasn't been. And there's this view up until now that about 15% of fraud in the UK is organised. I want to just come to that back in a minute, because part of the work we've been doing is to try and assess this. So what we did is we got ourselves involved in some communities. And we worked with 4 researchers. So my colleague John Graham at the time was leader of the Police Foundation. He and I supervised it. 4 researchers: Sarah Webb, who's actually worked with Rick in the past, Ruth Crocker, Mike Skidmore, and Sarah Gardner. 2 of them, Sarah and Ruth, put themselves in a community and interviewed all members of the community, all the stakeholders in the community, the police, the social services, and a whole range of groups. And looked at 731 fraud reports. And when we looked at these fraud reports, by the way, we were able to look at the intelligence behind them as well. So what researchers typically get is what you can see in terms of a report that is the sort of public side. We were able to look at intelligence report. We got access to intelligence data, so we could see the thinking going on and we could compare the two. I'll come back to that in a minute. And we looked at the different categories of fraud. I'm not going to go into that because fraud's got lots of categories. And here was the point. When you begin to look at this information, we then, I'm just going to tell you very briefly because it's quite an important point, we tried to identify, was this fraud linked to a known organised crime group? Was this fraud linked to ongoing continual activity? Was this fraud linked to an offender committing more than one offence? Was it linked to multiple offenders? In other words, we took the criteria of organised crime, and then we tried to link whether these frauds that we could see could be classified as definitely organised, definitely not, or in between, we can't tell, maybe. And the purpose of this was for the first time to try and get to this hidden figure. How much of fraud is actually linked to organised crime, given this 15% thing? And what we found is that between 31 and 40%, 45% of all frauds occurring locally are linked to organised crime groups. And so this is at least twice as much, maybe 3 times as much as the previous estimate. In other words, organised crime and organised fraud is a much bigger deal. So not only is fraud a bigger deal, organised fraud is also a bigger deal. And the question is, how much of a bigger deal? I mean, if you're a victim, does it matter whether it's organised or not? And of course, most of the time you don't know. And here comes the problem. If you say to victims, well, you were a victim of an organised offence, how are they going to know? You know. So, but what we found is, on average, individual victims of organised fraud lose a lot more, over twice as much, as those who are from a non-organised fraud. In other words, it does matter. It matters because the impact is so much greater on victims themselves. Now, I'm simplifying this because it depended on the fraud in case. So investment fraud, it was much higher. With other types of fraud, it was much lower. But the point is that it's a very, very serious matter that fraud is such a big deal, so much is linked to organised crime, and when you link at the organised aspect, you see that the difference for victims is so much greater. That's the point upon which I most want to go away with. Now, I went into prison and I interviewed fraudsters, and it is striking just how much this organised aspect has an impact on practice. Let me just give an example, if I might. The last fraudster that I interviewed, fascinating case actually. This is a bit of an aside, by the way, but interview in prison. And this chap, very bright guy, right? He was an entrepreneur, got a degree, not been in trouble before, in late 20s, started a successful business, and according to him, he was made bankrupt by a supplier not paying him. And he felt very aggrieved. He'd been honest all his life, he'd made a lot of money, and he felt badly treated. So, as a consequence of this, he got involved in a fraud, purposefully, got caught and got sent to prison for a year. And while he's in prison, he's thinking to himself, now what went wrong there? By the way, I hope you're all trustworthy, because I'm about to teach you how someone committed a fraud. I'm telling you this for the purposes of education, not to go and do it. And he's thinking, now what can I do? Why did I get caught? And how could I do this differently? This is what you're up against, by the way. And he came up with this thinking. Look, the reason I got caught was because people realise very quickly that money's been taken. And that's the point they act. What if I could think of a fraud where money was not taken immediately? What could it be? He spent every night in his prison cell thinking this through. And he came up with an idea. I'm going to tell you what this idea is. You can tell why I've got to trust you on this. And this was his thinking. When people, this is the UK example, I'm assuming it's the same in Australia, but the point translates anyway. When people buy their car insurance, they pay for their car insurance, but they never use it until the point upon which they need to make a claim. So the vast majority of people would pay for that insurance and would hardly bother about it again until they had to make a claim. What if I could sell fake car insurance? How could I do that and look legitimate? So basically, he researched car insurances. And he set up a website, obviously as a criminal, and he paid someone to set up a criminal website where he acted as a broker for car insurance. He found out about the accreditation process, found a way of making it look legitimate. I won't tell you how he did that, although that was very clever. And basically paid a click-through service. So what would happen is someone would look at the website, ring a number where he would keep very basic information, and the person employed to do that didn't realise it was a con. They thought they were employed by a company normally. Kept very basic information. On the back of that basic information, he would ring back the person concerned and say, he rang for a car insurance quote. He would know their car, he would know their address, and he would know how much they paid. And since he wasn't a legitimate broker, he would offer it cheaper. And so, unsurprisingly, he found that money kept flowing in. And his idea was, if you do this, you're going to get caught pretty quickly. So do it for a couple of months, take all the money and run. And that's basically what he did. The trouble was, it was so lucrative. It was extremely profitable. And as a consequence of being profitable, two things happened. One is, when people rang up to make a claim, he decided he would just pay it. So he could keep the con going. You think about it for a second. You ring up your broker, they say, right, I've just had a damage, You say, how much was it? And you say $2,500, and he says, I'll put a cheque in the post to you. What are you going to say?
Thank you.
You know, they're quiet. So he just kept it going. But he kept it going too long. And one day, he used his own phone on a transaction. That's how he got caught, actually, just by using his own phone on one bit. But anyway, back to the con. The problem he had was getting money out of the bank account. And what he did, he got loads, he called them smackheads, drug addicts, because he'd been in prison before, so he knew lots of criminal contacts. So he got people to set up legitimate accounts. They were real people, not fake accounts. And he controlled their account. He paid them to control their accounts. And he had lots of credit cards, and he would go out and just withdraw money from lots of different accounts. Here was the problem. He had to be very careful about not getting caught with lots of credit cards on him. Imagine getting arrested by the police. That was one of his biggest dangers, of getting caught with all the credit cards on him. So he had to really think about how he did that. Anyway, and he was eventually caught. My point is, that's one type of organised crime activity from the voice of an offender. And just how clever and how under the radar he operated. And that's the point about organised crime. The continual need to be good at acting under the radar. And because people act under the radar, that's how they're able to get away with it so often. But we mustn't assume that it's not very important. And and this whole point is that organised crime has a bigger impact because people lose more, and because they're very good at making sure that other people don't find out what's going on. Just on that word organised fraud, by the way, when we were in the local communities, we found out in the 3 communities that we looked at that there were organised crime groups operating that weren't mapped at all. The police didn't even know about them. In one, there was loan sharks. Does loan shark mean anything? Is that word translates? Okay. There were loan sharks that were operating, who were extremely proficient. In another community, the organised fraud and organised sex trade had come together, creating a whole set of different sorts of problems. So it wasn't as if, even if you look at the ones that are known about, you've got the whole picture. What was clear from us, from talking in local communities, is that these things can crop up and disappear very quickly. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And so it is difficult for agencies. It is difficult to know how you respond for the best, because, and this thing called organised crime, we tend to think of it in terms of the mafia. In reality, groups come together and in very different ways and very different forms. So the ones that tended to be known about was where there were strong sort of family units at the heart of it, extended family ties. But often it isn't like that. Often it's loose groups coming together, individuals who work across organised crime groups and known for their specialism. So an organised crime group, it sounds such a convenient term, disguises in reality a whole host of arrangements, sizes, specialism, technical ability, connections, that make it a very difficult thing in practice to tackle. So I say that because sometimes we can talk in academia in very sort of general terms about tackling organised crime. And people's perception of organised crime and organised criminals is the mafia type of arrangement. And while that definitely does exist, and you've definitely got the Mr. Bigs who are very dominant in these groups, so it is also true that you've got very other different types that are very fluent. And of course you've also got the international connection, just to add to the joys of tackling. So when we begin to think about how we begin to tackle, sometimes it can sound simplistic. The reality is that it needs to be taken very, very seriously, coupled with the fact the whole point about being organised is you learn to operate under the radar. Having said that, when you're in local communities and we interview people, it's not very nice. What goes on, the intimidation, the violence, people know who the groups are often when they're family groups, and you don't fall out with them. Have quite a hold on what goes on locally. Of course they have a hold on what goes on locally. They've got to. They've got to make sure that you don't upset the wrong people. You've got to be very clever in the way you operate. And if you're going to continue a definition of organised crime, you have to be good at that. So the response bit needs a little bit of thinking about. There's no magic cure here. And of course, in every report, you've got to make recommendations, but bear in mind this point. So another local agencies working together. Let me just tell you about this bit. It's a statement of the obvious, isn't it? that local agencies must work together, or national agencies must work together. What lovely words to say. Partnership, collaboration, these sort of words that are thrown about with abandonment, and to be honest, always have been. The problem is, in practice, this is extremely complicated. And let me just give you some examples in the context of fraud. I'm going to say a few words about the sex trade in a minute. But almost mirror image there, that local agencies did come together, and they sometimes can be very effective. But part of the problems with these sorts of things, we went to one information sharing group. Information sharing, another little gem that in theory is a no-brainer, in practice is fraught with problems. And part of the issue for us is we throw around these words, and it's very tempting at a national level or government level to talk about collaboration, partnership working, sharing, you know. Whoa! When you look at how that translates, these are some of the barriers we found. Individual agencies have got their own agenda. And so when, for example, the police come along and say, would you help us with an organised crime problem? Local agencies' response will be, yes, of course, but remember, that's not our priority. You know, we've got other agendas we're measured on and we've got to tackle. It wasn't we don't care, it was more, but look at what we're trying to do. You know, and so, second point was that, and that barrier was a big one. It wasn't often recognised as much, but it was a big one, that people sitting around a table to discuss organised crime, most of them there, that was not their priority, organised crime. And so when they were asked to do things from the police, it was the most important. Help us tackle organised crime. For these agencies' point of view, it was one thing to help out on amongst many different other priorities. So, sure, we'll come to a meeting, sure we want to get involved in helping, but get real. The second thing was that sometimes they would be asked for information and they would produce it. And their view was, it goes into a great big black hole. We never hear again whether it was useful or not. Why would we want to keep being part of that process? You know, if you're saying it's useful, what was useful? How was it useful? What we're not good at is feeding back the results. You know another problem? It might be years before it produces a result. It may never produce a result. We often don't know ourselves whether the information coming has produced a result, because the people who asked for it in the first place move on. And other people come in and they would never know. So there is this sort of real world issue about how this all translates into practice. And there's another point, that some of the agencies produced information and the police will say, we want it in a different form. If we don't do it in that form. Well, that's how we need it though, to be helpful. Small, but big. These things really do matter. Just completely separately and unrelated, I've just been in England talking with a group at the moment about how we can regulate, wrong word regulate, how we can audit crime partnerships of different sorts to help with some of these issues. Because they're really, really big ones in practice. So the point about local agencies coming together is, of course, in theory a great idea. But in practice it's fraught with all these sorts of issues. And then you've got culture, and then you've got time, and then you've got priorities, and then you've got legal remit, and then you've got objectives, all of which rarely align to make all this as good as in theory it seems it could be. So part of the point is that the local, this people working together is easy to say, difficult to do, and it's far from clear to us the mechanisms for solving this are in place. That we tend to stand back and say, let's collaborate, share, work together, partner, without thinking through it. It's just so convenient and so easy. But the realities are so much different. Having said that, there are examples of very, very good practice. The second point is that when we looked about what was going on in local communities, our view was, this is hidden, this is serious, and it's outside the boundaries of almost every agency. Fraud is not a sexy topic. Police officers don't want to be involved. Now, let me just tell you what's just going on right now as I speak. we've got a survey of police officers going on about their attitudes to fraud, right as we speak now. So I can't tell you the findings, I can just tell you that the right questions have been asked. We've just done a national survey of police forces about their attitudes to tackling fraud. And this is this follow-up project, so I can't tell you the findings at the moment. I can just tell you that we're beginning to look in more detail about, so what are we going to do? If this is the problem in reality, what are we going to do? Our point is this: it's very serious, it's large scale, and it's largely being ignored. And that's the story that comes through from the fraud. And where it's organised, it's even worse, because it's even more serious, it's even more high impact on victims, and even more ignored. And therein lies one of the big findings that we've taken through to the second stage. And this thinking differently bit is really problematic, not least because not only is fraud not sexy, you've got the added problem that it's very time consuming to do. You know, one of the great things about going to a burglary is you get some sort of immediate impact. You know, there's some things to do and people care about it, or a robbery, you know, or some incident in the community. But fraud, you know, people aren't taking to the streets to fraud. They should be, but they're not. In fact, no one is, and you know, hence this ongoing burden on people. What we're calling for is a response to this, a much bigger sort of thinking about both what the problems are and about what the solutions are. Okay, if I could just say a little bit about the sex trade. What we were looking at was how much the off-street sex trade. Now, I don't know how much people in this room know about the sex trade. I have to say, I didn't know much myself. Probably good for my credentials, I didn't know much about it actually. But there's two types very simply. There's the on-street sex trade, sort of prostitutes on the street corner that you see, and there's the off-street sex trade, which takes place in brothels, which of course is much more difficult to see. And because one of the features of what we were looking about was organised crime in areas where you can't see, we focused a bit on the off-street sex trade. And the impact this has in local communities, and the responses and challenges again. So I'm going to go very briefly through this because I want to make some more general points. Again, what we found is organised crime pervades the off-street sex market. And once again, the response is lacklustre to say the least. No single agency takes responsibility for it. And exploitation is rife and traumatic and in some ways galling to confront. In one single city, we found 65 brothels over a 2-year period, and more than 3/4, listen to my words here, displayed links to organised crime groups. Now, got to be very careful about that word organised and crime and saying that they run brothels, but in over 3/4 there were clear links to organised crime groups. There was a high turnover of workers in brothels. Of course, what's happening is that organised crime groups are moving women about, mostly women about, and in 29% of the brothels, so you know, approaching a third, well over a quarter anyway, there was evidence that sex workers' movements were being controlled. Not nice stuff, you know, really quite serious, all out of view, and not the responsibility of any single agency. It sounds horrendous as a sort of member of the public looking on about what's going on here. And these people were being dreadfully exploited. More than half the brothels were managed by more than one offender, as far as we could tell. In other words, it might have been more than that. A third were run by offenders who also managed other brothels. And there was this link to other types of drug offences, mostly drug supply. You know, not nice stuff. And there was evidence that 1 in 5 had forced, intimidated or coerced women in providing sexual services. That's where the evidence was. And of course there was fear and anxiety and angst there, which is just horrendous, given the fact this can't be seen, is organised crime, it's exploitation, and no single agency is responding, and no agency overall is taking responsibility for this in any way. There was reports of sex bonding, debt bonding because of their activities, drawing your passport, pay back out your debt for getting you trafficked into the country. Really horrific stuff. And this was, again, not something that was systematically being responded to. 18% of sex workers were unable to produce passport or other relevant documents. We actually spoke to one police team that had gone in to do a raid on a brothel. And when they arrived, the woman in charge was from an East European country. And she said to them, as the police arrived in an East European language, right everybody, you know, oh, okay, right everybody, I wonder why you take so much interest, Rick, in that side. I thought, goodness me, hey, sex work.
Do we think snooze would work? Yeah.
Okay.
No comment, Mark.
In a language, East European language, right everybody, you know what to do. But one of the police officers spoke that language, which was a bit fortunate. But here was the point, they're all ready for a police raid. They knew what to do. Don't say anything to anyone. You know, be quiet now. And it's very difficult very difficult to challenge this. Oddly enough, just as an aside again, I interviewed a police officer actually, who was talking about how they were responding to a joint operation. And they did a joint operation with the immigration service on a brothel. It's a great initiative, really. You know, really good idea to work together. Here was the problem: the police wanted to find out what was going on, to monitor it, to get to Mr. Big or Mrs. Big, but typically Mr. Big. That was what the police wanted to do. The immigration service wanted to get the people out of there straight away and get them back to where they belong. You know, back to their home countries. Completely different objectives about an operation. Working together, but different objectives. Time and time and time again. In another brothel, by the way that they responded to it was they were having trouble finding a way of closing the brothel, proving that activities were going on there. In the end, what they did is the fire service did an inspection of the building, and it wasn't fit. So they closed it down because of the fire service being involved. It was the fire service who had the power to do something about that particular problem. So the value of other agencies coming in and helping is phenomenal. But of course, it's got to be coordinated, it's got to be done in a way that's meaningful. So just as I'm being clear that it doesn't work very often together, that's not to disguise the fantastic benefit that comes from having joint operations where it's all aligned. It's getting that alignment done in a meaningful way that is so important. I'm going to rush through this because I can find a way to do it. So, local response. You have to look to it to find it. It's not immediately visible. People don't go into brothels and say, hey, there's a brothel over there, you better go do something about it, because the reason for going to brothels are obvious. Okay, so that's point number one. Developing intelligence on these, developing information about what's going on is largely unavailable. It's not developed. And this is very, very serious stuff. It matters a lot who these people are. And while multi-agency strategies do sometimes exist, once again, the problems of operating them so that they're meaningful are problematic. Let me just go back to this point now. So, if you want to get a copy of the report, you can download it from the website free of charge, and you're welcome to do it. Overall, though, this is the point I want to make about organised crime. That we are comfortable now about what the definition is. I say that, not that it's not contested, it's greatly contested. But we know it's serious, we know it's more than one offender, we know it's ongoing activity. Play all with the words as much as you like, but there's a lot of comfort around what that is. We know there are different types of organised crime groups. We know they operate in different ways. We have underestimated the problems that causes people in local communities. We've tended to not think of it in terms of what it's like for the victim. And yet, when we see it from the bottom up, it's traumatic in the extreme. The more we look at organised crime, the more we begin to realise just how dynamic it is, how much crime it's responsible for, how good it is about staying under the police radar. When you're an organised criminal, you must be careful you don't upset the wrong people. Because if you upset the wrong people, it brings attention to you. And of course, the one thing that you do not want is attention. Actually, that whole point about attention is a really big deal. Aside for a second. When in going into prisons, the start of this is going to sound very, very bad. But it's going to be healed in the second half. So I'm just telling you now. I go into prisons, and when the offenders have come out of prison, they've taken me stealing with them. Right, so I've been stealing with offenders. That's the bit that sounds bad. But, of course, I haven't stolen. But properties in the UK, companies in the UK, now hire us to go stealing from them. And what we do is, in fact, we did it 3 weeks ago, got a team together, and we go into some of the big retail premises, which you would know even in Australia, they're quite world famous. And we would go into them and we steal from them. And we take all the stuff, then we take it all back, and we tell staff what we've done, and we say, how would you respond to this problem? Okay. And here's what you learn, a wonderful insight to the world of crime from the viewpoint of the offender. Just first and foremost, how much it's to your advantage. Despite all the security there, they don't know when you're coming. You know, you've got the element of surprise on any particular moment, on any particular day. How all the security measures can be there, but unless they're geared to tackling you, unless they're focused and they're on the ball, security in itself is not a big deal. Crime prevention is not a big deal, unless it works effectively in matching you that day. But the point that I learnt in going stealing was, of course, going stealing, by the way, and giving all the goods back, but the point I learnt about this was that what really worried me is not the crime prevention, but the staff. And you know, when I go into prisons, Rick said I did the national evaluation of CCTV. I'm going to come forward off the camera for a second, but if I'm about to steal right now, or commit any crime right here, right now, the thing I always have to worry about, always, is you and you. You're too close. You can see what I'm doing and you could intervene. And of course the thing is that since you're there, cameras on a wall don't make a lot of difference to me, because you're what I'm worried about. You know, I'm not going to do something because you're too close. I'm hardly worried about a camera on a wall. Just an aside a second. One of the things I did when I was doing the work on CCTV is I went into prison and I asked offenders what they thought. You know, and of course, part of the point about offenders is they don't want to be made visible. The risk of being caught is the great thing. And what they said about CCTV in general terms was this, that okay, it's a threat to be managed, but you know, you wear a disguise, you don't look at the camera, most of the images anyway are rubbish. So if you do get caught on camera committing an offence, it's very, very serious. You know, you're in trouble, but most of the time you don't. And most of the time it's okay. But there is this point about you have to make sure in everything you do that you don't risk getting caught. Reduce that risk of getting caught is a really big driver. And so it is for the world of organised crime. It just focuses solely on making sure that you operate under the radar, and they're very, very skilled at it and very, very able at making sure they stay under the radar all the time. So in thinking about how we respond, we've got to get away from these simplistic notions that there's organised crime is groups working together on a continuous basis and they're all the same. They are so diverse. And the links to international, the type of crimes they commit and the way that they're organised, whether it's family or professional groups coming together, the link between the legitimate world and the illegitimate world is phenomenal. The role of facilitators, accountants, solicitors and others is much more prolific than I thought it was. And in this world of organised sex crimes, it's strikingly frightening, to tell you the truth, strikingly frightening about the intimidation and the trouble faced by groups who are at the end of this with very little recourse, with very little remit about what to do and how to get a response to a problem. One of the interesting things, we had an East European group that were prolific in terms of shoplifting. Another myth, by the way, was that there is this view in the UK that the shoplifting gangs are caused by Eastern European gangs. Well, actually, most of the organised crime we found was actually committed by the UK, but a disproportionate amount of Eastern European crime that was committed was organised. But when we looked at the group that was most prolific on the organised crime group, they were also the most victimised in terms of intimidating, trafficking and what have you. What seems to be happening is these groups are coming over. They're being intimidated and threatened and organised into organised criminal activity. You know, we've got to link the two sides in a way that hasn't been done much up to now. So we're now working on a follow-up study, trying to look at all this in much more detail. We're now much more engaged in thinking about the problem of fraud and how it can be responded to, given the fact it's not a priority on any agency's, not a very high priority on agencies engaged in tackling it. This has got much more currency with the finding that it's so prolific, and much more currency with the finding that fraud is a big impact offence. But you know, it's easy, isn't it? It's easy to sit back here as an academic and talk about, or researcher, and talk about its impact and how it makes a difference. But this brings me just to the final thing I'd like to say, Ricky, if I could, is that what all this has taught me is this fundamental point that all those offenders say almost every interview. Almost every time I do an interview with an offender, in fact every time I do an interview with an offender, I never fail to come away thinking, my goodness me, something they say reminds me of just how weak the response is, how great the dangers are. And that there's a world of difference between having policing, having crime prevention, having security, and having effective policing, effective crime prevention, and effective security. There's a world of difference between being outstanding and being good and being average. And that it really is important to make the difference between the two. The very last time I was in prison, I was on the wing waiting to be escorted out. And this chap came up to me. By the way, when you're in a prison on the wing, waiting to be... Does the wing make sense? It's an area of a prison. It translates, okay. Area of prison. And I was waiting to be escorted out, and this prisoner came up to me and said, always slightly tricky, came up to me and said to me, you're Martin Gill, aren't you? I said, I am. He said to me, I hear you're interviewing fraudsters at the moment. I said, I am. He said, well, I'm in here for fraud, he said, but I can't speak to you. I said, why not? He said, I can't tell you. He said, but I want to tell you something. He said, now listen to this. He said, if I tell you this, do you agree when you give talks to people, or you will tell them what I'm about to tell you? Whoosh. I said, well, it all depends on what you say. He said, well, okay, I get your point. He said, but this is what I want to tell you. He says, let me be clear, I want you to tell people that you're talking to. So straight from a prison cell to you. This is what he said. I'm in here for fraud, which I deny. He said, but when I was on the outside, incredibly, my company was responsible for tackling fraud. He said, and in that role, I found it extremely difficult. I found it difficult because people in my company didn't really care about fraud. I did, but the company didn't care about fraud. Even different departments wouldn't really share information. And even if they did share information, they weren't really geared up for helping me present it to the police. And sometimes they didn't even want to present it to the police. They just want to brush it under the carpet. And even if you did present it to the police, you couldn't get them interested. He said, don't you think that's an awful position to be in? I said, well, I do. He said, and this is my point. Come in here and everyone's sharing information. Everyone's sharing information. Who are the best victims? What's the best methods of getting to them? How do you get round, make sure you don't get caught? Well, we've all had the experience of getting caught, and we're sharing information about how not to get caught again. He said to me, don't you think that's the wrong way round? I said, oh, you do? He said, well, share that with everybody. So, there I'm sure. My final point is this, though, if I might. That what all this has taught me is there's a world of difference between having this and being good at it. And that being good at it is extremely difficult to do. That sometimes this world of crime prevention or policing or security is seen as something which is very straightforward. But it's not, you know. Understanding crime and responding appropriately to it is an extremely skilled task. And one thing I would like you to look at, as Rick mentioned in the introduction, that I've been involved in Australia actually for this reason. On Thursday in Melbourne, we have the 3rd Outstanding Security Performance Awards. Now, award schemes have got their, people have got a jaundiced view for reasons which I understand. But the idea behind this is trying to get a worldwide movement. In 8 countries at the moment, I've just come back from America, from the American hospitals, where 2,000 people attended. Try and get recognition to the fact it does matter that you do it well. And if we can identify the individuals and the teams and the groups that are responding appropriately to crime and get worldwide recognition to those who are doing it well, we're on a stepping stone to a different way of behaving and a different way of thinking. And this ultimate aim of making sure that what we do works has been a theme that's run through governments around the world. The trouble is that, and Rick and I were talking about this last night, and again this morning, it's very difficult to do that well. It's very difficult to set up and evaluate it well. And there's all sorts of things that get in the way. But what we mustn't do is forget how important it is. Because sometimes when you're in a university or research department or a government building, you can forget the impact this has on victims. That on victims it is astronomically bad. And that to ignore their plight and to not take their plight seriously is a gross injustice for any good society and any good and group of people, not least those who are involved in fighting crime. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.